All right, thank you. So this is the first time I've done one of these things. So this is an interesting experience, although I did teach online this spring, so I know what it's like to talk to a computer. So we're going to talk about a paper that we've been working on titled, currently titled Offshoring Inflation. I'm not sure whether that's exactly the final title, but it's what we're going with for now. This is with Diego Comin, who's somewhere probably in the chat room. We're going to talk about two broad questions today. The first is, to what we're interested in questions like, to what extent did globalization and trade integration suppress inflation? And because globalization is kind of passé at the moment, if you're more interested in deglobalization, there's an interesting question like going forward, if we deglobalize going forward, is that going to let the inflation genie back out of the bottle? And then the second question is related to that. It's sort of a clarifying question. We're interested in particular thinking about what the role of offshoring was in understanding how trade influenced inflation. So we want to think about trade and inputs, not just trade and final goods here. And I'll clarify in a few minutes, relative to the international macro New Keynesian literature, that's actually a relatively rare thing to take seriously, at least in this inflation discussion. So if you ask a policymaker, if I knew how to conduct polls on Zoom, I'd conduct a poll, but I don't know how. If you asked a policymaker whether globalization has suppressed inflation, I would think you'd get 90+% of people at least saying yes. The answer to that question is yes. So for example, Mark Carney in his 2019 Jackson Hole speech talked about how the integration of low-cost producers in the global economy is a part of a steady disinflationary bias. So our view is that's a statement that needs to be subjected to some scrutiny. In particular, we think existing theory and evidence on that question is incomplete, and we'll talk about how we're going to improve on what we think we know so far. So what we're going to do is study a model of trade and inflation in a New Keynesian framework that's going to add to a canonical kind of textbook New Keynesian model, essentially two features. We're going to think about offshoring, meaning imports of intermediate inputs in addition to trade and final goods, and we'll talk about how those two things in a New Keynesian framework operate in different ways in terms of their impacts on inflation. And secondarily, in the model, we're going to use an idea from trade. All of you who are trade economists have been seeing this used over and over and over again in the recent literature. We're going to think about a sufficient statistics approach to analysis of the model. So in particular, we're going to treat trade shares, the share of final input expenditure on home goods, as a primitive object that we're going to then think about changes in that over time and trace through what the effects of that are on inflation. And we'll do that on the one hand in data, where we're going to link domestic sourcing shares to data on producer and consumer prices. And then in addition, we'll do it in the model where we're going to use domestic sourcing shares, treat them as shocks, and trace out the evolution of inflation in the model. And we're going to do this in the context of the US. There's nothing special about the US as to why we chose the US to do this, other than that it's an interesting country where we kind of know the data and we know what to look for. And we're going to look at the US over the last several decades as it has been globalized. We can talk about other countries if you're interested. So to kind of frame discussion, let me do a bit of background, sort of thinking about the link between trade and consumer prices. Think about consumer prices basically as being the bundle of domestically produced and imported final goods. There's kind of two channels that you want to think about in terms of the way trade could impact prices. One is what I'll talk about as the old channel, where talking about trade in consumption goods. So falling prices of imported consumption goods and substitution of imports for domestic goods is going to tend to lower the aggregate price level. In addition, if you have import competition lowering markups, that could also restrain the prices of domestic goods. So that's kind of the things that people have thought about traditionally in this literature. What we're going to focus on is what I'll refer to as the quote-unquote new channel. And it's not entirely new, but it's useful for framing. We're going to talk about offshoring and trade and inputs. So on the production side, falling prices of imported inputs are going to reduce domestic production costs, and then you can think about producers substituting from domestic to foreign suppliers and amplifying the production cost effects of cheaper intermediate inputs. And so writ large, that's going to lower production costs, and then it should lower the prices for domestically produced goods and services. Okay? And there on the input side, you can also worry about issues about direct and indirect exposure through network linkages. We'll say something about that as we go through the data. So we're going to kind of initially in the data put those two old and new channels side by side in a consistent accounting framework and think about using US BEA data, what the relative role of those two channels is. And what we're going to do is show you that basically the new cost channel seems to matter quite a bit. So I'll show you first output price inflation is lower for industries that are exposed to offshoring, meaning that they themselves offshore, or industries that they source from offshore, sourcing of intermediate goods. And then from an accounting perspective, it looks like in the data, the price level is about 15% lower as a result of trade, and about half of that's coming from consumption imports and half of that's coming from offshoring. So the new cost channel seems to matter in the data, and collectively trade looks actually relatively important as far as I'm concerned in the data. So the question is then what to make of that. That's essentially an accounting exercise. So then what we do is pivot and we sort of inspect the accounting exercise. So the accounting exercise doesn't necessarily tell you what the role of trade was on influencing inflation, essentially because the accounting exercise can't answer macro counterfactual questions like what would have happened to inflation if globalization hadn't happened. There's a whole bunch of endogenous stuff in the model that matters for understanding that. And in addition, there's a very basic primitive issue once you think about inflation. It's that at a basic level, monetary policy determines what the inflation rate is. So you need to think about monetary responses to the trade shocks and that mediating the impact of trade on the overall price level. So what we're going to do in the model then, we're going to write down a simple New Keynesian framework. Literally what the model is it's like chapter, I forget what chapter it is in the Gali New Keynesian textbook. It's like chapter 8 of that textbook, augmented with trade and inputs and final goods, and then we're going to simulate it in a somewhat different way than is traditional in the new open economy macro literature. We're going to look at the effects of permanent shocks and phased permanent shocks. So what we're going to do in the model is actually show you in the model, trade integration is going to actually raise inflation. So we get a completely opposite result to what the accounting exercise tells you. And it's taken us a while to understand it, but I think we have a complete grip on the issue now. There are sort of two things that are important for understanding and keeping track of. One thing that's important for understanding why trade raises inflation in the model is the shock the globalization shock that we're going to analyze is a persistent, possibly permanent, rise in the sourcing of goods from abroad. And that shock is going to be phased in over time. So it's not a one-off shock, it's a shock that gets phased in over time. And so what you're going to get in the model is a discrepancy between when the shock arrives and when news of the shock arrives. Demand is going to respond immediately. And that's going to have the effect of pushing up inflation in the model. The second thing that's important to keep track of is that offshoring and final goods affect inflation differently. Sourcing of final goods from abroad and sourcing of inputs from abroad affect inflation differently, and we're going to trace out exactly what those linkages are. The standard intuition that people kick around for understanding the effect of trade on inflation only works for trade and final goods. Trade and inputs in the standard framework works differently, and it works in kind of a counterintuitive way. That'll be clearer as we collapse the model down to kind of the standard framework that everyone's used to. So I see chats going on. Am I supposed to be looking at these or not? Okay, Diego's implying that, so I'm going to ignore those. All right, so I'm gonna, in the interest of time, I'm not gonna spend any time on the literature. Well, okay, I'm gonna spend 1 minute on the literature. So I think of our paper as being related to at least three veins of the trade and macro policy literatures. So first of all, there's an interesting literature, an active literature now on import competition and industry prices. It kind of thinks in a differences context about what happens to prices in industries that are more or less exposed to trade. The initial accounting exercise Our paper is going to have kind of the feel of that, where I'm going to look at cross-sector issues in addition to aggregation of those cross-sector price changes. There's a related literature as well. I mean, there's active literature in the early 2000s about the effect of globalization on inflation. Much of that literature has focused on the Phillips curve in particular, because that's where trade is going to show up in the standard New Keynesian framework. They've talked a lot about slope and shifts of the Phillips curve, global slack in the Phillips curve, inflation synchronization across countries, and so on. What I'm going to do is divert your attention away from the Phillips curve to the IS curve, because the Phillips curve is not going to be what's explaining how inflation behaves in the US. It's going to be all about how trade impacts the IS curve in the New Keynesian framework. And then lastly, we're going to analyze the model in a slightly different way than the kind of New Keynesian people are used to thinking about temporary shocks. We're going to be worried about a persistent, possibly permanent shock, and so we're going to be thinking about a model with perfect foresight dynamics to understand the effects of that permanent shock. And so I learned a lot from a number of your papers about how to handle those issues in dynamic trade models. So those are kind of three pieces of the literature that I have learned a lot from. In terms of the roadmap for the talk, so like I said, think about the paper as having several stages. The first stage, I'm going to show you some data. I want to talk to you about those new and old channels for the effect of trade on inflation in the US. Then I want to show you in a simple, essentially the simplest New Keynesian framework we can write down, what the effect of trade is on inflation, in particular trade in inputs, distinguished from trade in final goods. And then we're going to give you a model answer to, has globalization suppressed inflation, by basically feeding in the history of shocks into the model. And then we'll deconstruct the model's somewhat surprising answer, I think, to that question. So first on the data part. So all I'm going to do here is I'm going to write down a very simple framework that you're all going to kind of recognize, that's going to link domestic sourcing shares to output prices, and then study what those output prices look like. Do the same exercise in the data. So think about two countries, think about many industries or sectors. Producers are going to essentially have nested CES production functions. There's going to be a top level at which they're substituting labor for composite input, a middle level in which, because there are multiple sectors, they're going to have to figure out how many inputs do I want to buy from one sector versus another. And then a bottom level where within each sector they're sourcing from, they're going to choose whether to source from home or abroad. Actually, typically they're going to source simultaneously from home and abroad. There's nothing complicated going on there. And for now, everything I do in this accounting framework, think long run, think flexible prices. I'm not going to worry about price rigidities yet. We'll do those when we get to the full model. All right. So again, kind of plain vanilla production structure, just to link sourcing to prices. So think about the output price of a particular industry. That's just going to be related to the marginal cost of that industry. This is a CES markup over marginal cost. Marginal costs are going to be composite of the price of domestic value added and the price of a composite input. This is the price of domestic value added. This is the price of the composite input, where this is the price of an input coming from sector S used by sector S prime. And there's going to be, here in the accounting framework, I'm just going to write down a Cobb-Douglas input-output structure. And then the price of that composite input from sector S prime to sector S is just a composite of prices of home and foreign produced goods in industry S prime. Okay, so that's just the tiered structure. Now just rewrite that using exact cat algebra. You get this set of expressions. I actually am not going to talk you through. When I give this to macro audiences who haven't seen the exact cat algebra, I have to explain to them what that is. You guys are okay with this, and so I'm just going to skip all that. But the thing that comes out of thinking about this way of writing down the production side is it leads you to initially think, well, maybe we can just use price data to do this analysis. For example, suppose I had like PPI prices to proxy for the prices of domestic goods, and BLS import prices to proxy for the price of imported inputs. Maybe I could just trace those through the IO structure and look at the relative effects of domestic and imported prices. So we're concerned about doing that for the following reason. Essentially, measurement problems abound in doing that exercise. We go into some detail about that in the paper. My biggest concern is actually that the import price indices seem to be entirely missing all of the benefits of the switch from domestic to foreign sources that has happened over the last several decades. If you look at like the U.S. import price index, it's basically flat during this period, while imports have been rising substantially. And so it's just, you can't understand the rise of imports using any of the standard price index data.
Rob?
But we do sort of believe that relative prices have been driving that substitution of foreign sources. Sorry, did someone?
Yeah, Rob, this is Ricardo. I have a quick question.
Yes, sir.
In the previous slide, so have you, the next one, have you thought about how this would, I mean, because you can do the hot algebra now, because you're assuming like constant markups, right?
Sure.
Like so have you, could you use some data if you think about variable markups to actually get this like hot algebra stuff? Or have you thought about it?
I have not fully worked that out yet. That is on my to-do list. We are studiously avoiding talking about variable markups throughout this paper thus far. If people push us in that direction, I'm willing to go down that direction. I guess the main reason is because variable markups, you start getting a whole different set of issues that arise, and we actually want to put the spotlight on more basic issues about the new Keynesian model and the way the trade dynamics fit into it, and the way inputs fit into it in a different way than trade and final goods. But I'm completely sympathetic to saying that you might want to extend this model in the direction of having variable markups so that import competition restrains pricing power. And then how the exact head algebra goes through, that's a whole other issue. It probably depends on exactly how you write things down. I'm not 100% sure.
Thanks.
Rob, sorry, two clarifying questions. So this is
Yes,
to be
sir.
like a real economy, right? I don't see money.
So far, everything is real. So think long run here, flexible price. I'm going to show you a new Keynesian model where there are rigidities and there are price adjustment frictions in a minute.
So then my question, it's like, so there's no exchange rates here. What is inflation really? So shouldn't we be looking at, so what's the numerator, I guess, at the end of the day? You're making, yeah. How do we think about inflation in a real economy? Should we think relative to wages? Because real wages have to go up when trade, when you actually increase trade, right? When you open
I understand your concerns. I think your concerns are well-founded. In particular, there's a feedback from price changes to policy rules that pins down the actual rate of inflation. And so, yes, we're going to get there when we get to the model. Right now, the initial stuff I'm going to show you is just try to demonstrate the role of the, it's essentially an accounting exercise to demonstrate the role of inputs. And initially, I'm going to show you cross-sector stuff where all of those issues about what's happening in the aggregate price level go away. And then we'll get into the aggregate price level. And I'll show you something moderately misleading and then explain why it's moderately misleading and how you're going to get, we need a model to actually sort things out. All right, so anyway, so the next step is basically, I told you we don't want to actually use the price data. We want to find a way to get around the problems of measurement of prices of the import price deflator. So we're going to use domestic sourcing shares to do that. So just define the domestic sourcing share, and most of you know the mechanics of this. Essentially, it's the price of the home good relative to the price of some composite. These are sector-to-sector sourcing shares, but the basic logic of sourcing shares holds. So just plug those in. Anytime you see this price ratio throughout the system I just showed you, plug in this, modified by the elasticity. So you're going to get input, sector-to-sector input prices that look like this. Depends on the domestic sourcing. You're going to then get output prices that depend on domestic sourcing fed through an input-output structure. In particular, stacking and taking logs gets you an expression that looks like this, where changes domestic sourcing get fed through the input-output structure to give rise to changes in sector level. This is a vector of sector level output prices. Okay, so that's just repeating that. This is exactly the same equation where now I've imposed the assumption that just assume for a minute the elasticity is the same across all sectors. That then gives us this, which is essentially a measure of each industry's exposure to offshoring linked to its output prices. And the other thing that determines its output prices is what the price of domestic content is. And so the first thing I'm going to show you is I'm going to show you what these domestic output prices look like, essentially plotted against this offshoring shock for individual industries over the long term. So I just want to do a long run analysis initially. And then we're going to use data from the BEA industry input output accounts. They're going to give me the price of gross output. So that's where this is coming from. And then we're going to use the annual input-output data from 97 to 2016, which has 71 industries to basically compute the A's and the domestic sourcing shares. So that's going to give us then this term from the PEA input-output tables. All right, so if you do that, and again, you look at long differences from 1997 to 2016, you get this plot. So this is the offshoring shock on the y-axis. Negative numbers here mean an industry was more exposed to offshoring, meaning that they sourced more, or the industries that they're connected to sourced more from abroad. And these are log price changes in that industry. So this industry, I don't actually know what it is, has minimal price changes over this period and relatively high exposure to offshoring. This industry up here has actually negative exposure to offshoring, meaning its foreign sourcing went down, and it has relatively faster price growth. You all can run the eyeball regression. There's essentially a positive correlation across sectors in terms of the long run, saying that sectors more exposed to offshoring seem to have had slower price growth than sectors less exposed. Okay. Just for interest, because a lot of you guys probably like trade elasticities, this actually gives you, if you run that naive regression, it returns an estimate of the elasticity that is 1.5. So it's stunningly like consistent with a lot of macro evidence on elasticities. I was shocked when I actually ran that regression and something sensible came back. I don't want to take that too seriously, but it's kind of interesting. One thing that stands out in this picture in terms of the shading is that I've separated agriculture and natural resources from manufacturing and services. This relationship holds pretty strongly in manufacturing because there's a lot of spread in offshoring. It also holds across manufacturing versus non-manufacturing sectors. So here's that plot in a little different way. Here's the exact time series. This is the relative offshoring shock in manufacturing relative to non-manufacturing. So manufacturing has been more exposed to the offshoring phenomenon. And this is the relative price of the manufacturing sector relative to the non-manufacturing sector in the data. You see that both of these series are declining, meaning that there's a decline in the relative price of manufacturing that's going on at the same time as manufacturing is becoming more exposed to offshoring. And actually the timing lines up reasonably well. During the decade, from the mid-90s to the mid-2000s, manufacturing becomes more exposed to foreign inputs, and that's when manufacturing prices fell relative to non-manufacturing prices in the US. So given that structure, one can then do the naive thing and say, well, listen, I have the price changes there. I can't just aggregate them up using sectoral expenditure shares to look at aggregate prices, in particular consumer prices. So that's what I'm going to do here. So think about the consumer price level as being, a weighted Cobb-Douglas composite of sectoral consumption prices, and then sectoral consumption prices depend on the prices domestically produced goods in a sector and imports, and then we're going to proxy for the relative price of imports to domestically produced goods using domestic sourcing shares for final goods. So you can then write the log change in the aggregate consumer price level is decomposed into the price coming from essentially domestic value added, like this is like a domestic GDP deflator component. There's a component due to offshoring, and there's a component that's related to foreign sourcing of final goods, okay? And so what I'm going to do next is just plot this over time, this and the individual components on the right-hand side over time. So if you look at aggregate consumer prices, they're in the blue line here, so they're rising over time, quite sensible. This is the price of domestic value added. It's rising faster than is the price of aggregate consumption. Why is that? Well, one reason is because we're sourcing more foreign final goods. That's part of the story. But the second is that there's increased offshoring. So those are the two individual components, or these two dashed lines. And so the total impact of trade is then this dashed dot line at the bottom. It's exactly equal to the gap between these two series. And so the takeaway from this is just to say, if you're looking at this from an accounting perspective, it looks like trade looms large in terms of thinking about aggregate price developments, both cross sectors as well as in the aggregate from an accounting perspective. It looks like trade is having a reasonably large effect on the order of 15 percentage points on the overall consumer price level.
Sorry, Rob,
Now,
comment
yes.
on the previous figure. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So Peter Schock basically was documenting something similar, that the
Okay.
value added in the US has increased, although manufacturing sector has been going down. And I guess what in the data, what he was finding
he's doing quantities. These are prices.
Yes, I know. But in
Okay.
value, he was showing it to me. It's not in a paper. I guess what we're discussing is there seems to be some selection, like the firms that actually remain. So think about the firms that actually stay are the ones with high value added, let's say, that produce certain types of goods. You don't have anything about firms here, right? Selection.
But see, on this side, I would expect, because these are value added prices, I would have expected the firms that survive to have low value added prices relative, in other words, low own factor costs relative to firms that don't. And so I think that actually works in the opposite direction if there's weeding out of firms over time.
Okay.
Because this is basically the cost of the firm's labor and capital divided by its productivity.
Yes.
And so if more productive firms are getting selected over time, you should actually be seeing that growing slower rather than faster.
Now I was thinking about the ones that remain are the ones that actually import goods, which actually have more.
So that may be affecting survival and therefore affecting the aggregate import shares. That I agree with. So that I think is built somewhere into here.
Good. Thank you.
Okay.
Rob, one other question, just stepping back a little bit, and some of the comments we've made, it kind of reminds me of the macro literature about oil shocks for inflation. And I remember when I was young, then Milton Friedman really complained about that because it's like, oh, that's about relative prices. That has nothing to do with inflation. And I wonder if you could kind of connect this to that, because there does seem to be something to that argument, not the Friedman one, but the original thing that somehow oil shocks led to inflation, and yet
the Friedman counter argument was never reason for a price change, right?
Yeah, so he just said, oh, the relative price of oil went up, but that doesn't make inflation.
Okay, good. Actually,
so it's similar to the things that people have said here, or maybe the doubts we have about using a real model, but it might also give you a kind of another literature to tie this to where people think similarly.
I agree, but so so what's interesting is I find the doubts that everyone has expressed actually good. I mean, that's exactly what we want. What I'm going to do now is pull a bait and switch on you. So that aggregate price level accounting. Sorry, yeah, George.
Can I just follow up, just since we are talking about Friedman?
Yeah.
I have the quantity theory of money in my mind for everything that you're talking about, which I would have thought would have been the model you'd use for this. And that basically just tells me that the changes in the price level are going to be related to however much output is going to move, right? PY equals MD. So, if I'm just kind of thinking about like that model, if I think that going from 10% trade to 20% trade over 20 years, that's going to lower the price level by like, let's say 2% over 20 years. That seems like a really small change in the price level. So what's wrong with that calculation to sort of say like this is something that we shouldn't be too worried about?
No, I don't know about what you mean by too worried. So
what's wrong with that calculation?
I think we're all hitting on the same issue, which is so where we started was vis-a-vis the literature. It's very natural because people are focused on cross-sectional results in the literature to take those results and think about how do I aggregate those results up. That's essentially what I just did now in this accounting exercise. I showed you first a cross-sectional result and kind of looking at cross-industry prices. And I said, well, listen, I can take expenditure shares and just aggregate those prices, and I'm going to get this decomposition. And now what I want to tell you is this way of thinking about the problem is entirely misleading. So that's why I say I want to pull a bait and switch right now. Okay. I've set people up who want to be confused to be confused. Gotcha. That you cannot do that exercise for the following reason. Inflation depends on monetary policy, and inflation is endogenous. So I can't tell you that this line would be the same if I took away these lines. Like if I took away trade, I can't tell you domestic value-added prices would have risen the way they did in the presence of trade. And I also can't tell you what that would have done to aggregate consumer prices, because aggregate consumer prices depend on monetary policy. And so your Friedmanite theory is totally fine with me. I had even a simpler notion in mind initially, which was, suppose that you had a central bank that pegs the price level. What's the effect of trade on inflation? 0, because I'm pegging the price level. So endogenous monetary policy matters, right? So I think that's exactly along the exact same lines that you're thinking about. So what we're going to do now is pivot to a model where all of these questions end up being well defined, because I all of a sudden introduce a central bank and I introduce an inflation targeting rule that tells me what the effect. I can run counterfactuals that tell me what the effect of trade on inflation is in a well-defined model. Okay, so you all kind of got where the this is why when you present this as the non-dynamic trade group, people don't get this point, but I think you guys are all farther ahead than the average person we presented this to in the past. No offense to them, but they're just coming from different literatures. So here's what we're going to do in terms of the model. So we want to write down the simplest possible model to kind of parse the domestic sourcing share facts that we just worked out. And then what we're going to start with is a one-sector model, largely for simplicity. It gives us a way of rewriting the model to look like the standard 3-equation Keynesian model in a way that was tremendously useful for us to clarify our own intuition. And then otherwise, we're going to make it look like a standard new Keynesian model. So there's going to be continuing producers under monopoly competition, CS production demand structure, much like we had before. There's going to be a complete financial international market. We're going to have standard preferences, and we're going to introduce pricing rigidities. So there's going to be actual inflation dynamics. And we'll also put in a central bank that's targeting inflation. And what we're going to do is in this model, we're going to basically feed in the historical change in trade shares, and then analyze the retrospective impact of trade on inflation by doing that. One reason for doing that is it actually simplifies the analysis to a great extent. In particular, what it really helped us in terms of clarifying was that to kind of think historically, we don't really need to worry about the currency invoicing of trade, which ends up being a bit of a morass in this literature. And we're going to show you solutions to the model today that basically use log linear approximation. There's no necessary reason to do that, except log linearizing allows us to rewrite the model in a 3-equation new Keynesian structure to match what is out there. Basically, we're trying to teach trade to the new Keynesian macroeconomists, and so having a language that fits what they know is very helpful.
Hey, Rob, just to follow up on the assumption of Rottenberg, I mean, these are permanent big shocks.
Sure.
It seems like the Rottenberg would be like a really big, limitation. Like if we had state-dependent pricing, any aggregate implications would there'd be almost no aggregate implications because the guys would just adjust their prices right away.
I think that's a really interesting question. So I've thought a little bit about that. We chose to stick with the Calvo/Rottenberg way of thinking about pricing. Here Rottenberg has adjustment friction. So if you think adjustment frictions are real, maybe even if it's a permanent shock, you don't want to adjust 100% immediately. But in addition, I do think the state-dependent pricing thing is interesting. I would need to think about exactly how that would work in this model because of the dynamics. And so I don't know, like if there's a future shock, I'd have to think more about like what that means for the state-dependent pricing, relative to the contemporaneous shocks that are happening in the data. So I think all of I think that's a useful question.
So Rob, you don't have a ton of time left, so I'm going to suggest you keep moving on. Yeah, just ignore George. Just ignore George.
Yeah, exactly. We got more questions there than I thought. All right, so here's the one thing I want to say about the model. The model is essentially, like I said, the standard new Keynesian model. It's going to look different in the following sense. We're going to essentially using domestic sourcing shares. Every time we see this relative price ratio or this relative price ratio in the equilibrium, we're going to swap out for those domestic sourcing shares. So that's going to give us a set of equations for consumption and input use, standard labor market, labor supply and labor demand conditions, the goods market clearing condition, an equation that determines exports. We're going to have an Euler equation, a monetary policy rule. We're not monetary policy guys, so we picked the absolute simplest monetary policy rule, but we played around with, the standard kind of fancy ones that get used in the New Keynesian literature. So here the central bank is just targeting inflation. There's a domestic price Phillips curve that determines domestic price changes, and a consumer price consumer price that depends on that domestic price and sourcing of consumption goods. And then we're going to have perfect risk sharing in the baseline, just kind of mimic the standard setup. Okay. And then what we're going to be doing is through that model, feeding changes in domestic sourcing shares. We've talked about that we're going to allow the shares to change permanently. So we're going to consider permanent or quasi-permanent long-lived shocks in addition to temporary shocks. They actually have very different effects on inflation in this model. And we're going to solve for linear dynamics under perfect foresight as we introduce the news that globalization is happening and tell agents what the path of globalization is going to look like. All right, so these are the actual shocks aggregated up in the data. So this is the shock to sourcing of domestic final goods. This is the change in domestic sourcing of inputs. You can see the domestic sourcing of inputs declines more during the early period. So globalization is largely in the mid-2000s, a shock about offshoring in the US. And then there's actually a U-shape to that, which I wasn't fully aware of in the US data, but there's a U-shape in that. So there's interesting kind of U-shaped dynamics to how offshoring evolves in the US. So you take these shocks, you feed them through that model, you get this as a simulated inflation series. So inflation doesn't do anything off the bat. It rises and stays positive through most of the 2000s. So that's, a 1 percentage point rise in the rate of inflation. Forget about magnitudes on average. Forget about magnitudes for a minute because we can kill off some of these magnitudes via parameter assumptions. And then you get a decline in inflation that only arrives after after 2010. And then we're back in steady state inflation here. Okay, so what puzzled us initially and what puzzles everybody else is why inflation takes off as globalization sets in. Here's an approximate answer. If you sort of split out globalization or the change in the sourcing share for consumption goods versus intermediate goods, it's intermediate goods that are producing most of the rise in inflation, and in fact driving most of those inflation dynamics that I showed you. So again, it's kind of offshoring seems to be the important shock for the US. But now, why is that the case? Why does increased offshoring drive up inflation? So that's the puzzle we ended up with. I mean, some level it's a puzzle, is what the model tells you, but it's a puzzling relative to the conventional wisdom. The conventional wisdom, as I said, is that globalization reduced inflation. So I'm going to skip a bunch of the discussion about the conventional wisdom, but you find it all over the place. So pick your favorite central banker, look for a speech on globalization. Odds are they said somewhere that globalization reduced inflation. Mark Carney from the Bank of England, formerly the Bank of England and Bank of Canada, couched this as clearly as we've seen in terms of the movements in the Phillips curve. So he thinks about globalization as shifting down the Phillips curve and as a result, reducing inflation. So then the question is, what does the Phillips curve look like in the model and how does trade impact the Phillips curve in the model? So first point I want to make is this is the price for domestic, this is the Phillips curve for domestically produced goods, right? So inflation for domestically produced goods depends on the domestic output gap and expectations of inflation. The first point I want to make is there's no direct role for changes in leading to changes, at least inflation, changes in the aggregate price of domestically produced goods here. As you translate that into a consumer price Phillips curve, which is the headline inflation series we ultimately want to look at, you're going to see trade appearing, but it's going to be trade in final goods. So as a result of imports of final goods driving down or driving the terms of trade, that's going to lower the consumption price level relative to what it would have been relative to a situation where you weren't importing final goods, okay? So the standard story people tell about the Phillips curve does basically work as long as the shock you're worried about is a shock to foreign sourcing of final goods. And so that's one observation I want to make vis-a-vis the literature. Input sourcing shows up nowhere in those discussions of globalization and the Phillips curve. And in particular, out of this model, it shouldn't, because it doesn't affect inflation. And yet what I showed you is in the simulation, it does. Changes in offshoring do affect inflation. And so what that tells you is this Phillips curve analysis that is conventional is incomplete. So what's missing? What's missing is the demand side. So it turns out that offshoring of inputs features primarily on the demand side. So this is the IS curve that results from the model. It's completely standard. This is a real interest rate. What matters is the deviation in the real interest rate from the natural real interest rate. And the natural real interest rate in the model depends on the shocks or the changes in domestic and foreign sourcing. And in particular, it's the domestic sourcing of inputs that shows up in the natural rate. So what happens is, essentially, as you learn globalization is happening, and as the share of domestically sourced goods is falling over time, the source of the offshoring is increasing over time, that's making consumers richer over time and leading to an uptick in the growth rate of consumption in the flexible price equilibrium, which then drives up the real natural rate of interest. That is inflationary in these standard frameworks because it's making monetary policy look looser relative to the flexible price benchmark. And so in aggregate demand language, an expected future globalization is going to raise aggregate demand today, triggering an output gap and therefore inflation. And that's essentially the story of globalization-induced inflation in this model. And it is very hard to kill that story. So it is very hard to write down a model where when you're richer in the future, it leads you to want to consume less in the future. And as a result of that, leads to a negative output gap today. And in any event, I think that would be inconsistent with the way people usually think globalization affected inflation. So all I've shown you so far is like the plain vanilla New Keynesian framework with a couple of bells and whistles. We have looked at a variety of extensions of the model and essentially find the same thing throughout different extensions of the model. So you can add physical capital to the model. We've thought about models that relax perfect risk sharing, think about capital inflow shocks. We're doing this now in a multi-sector model that embeds the relative price mechanism we talked about initially with the aggregate inflation results that come from the New Keynesian model here. None of those models change the ultimate message, but they change obviously quantitative magnitudes and they change nuances of the story and all that sort of stuff. But the basic story from the one sector model goes through. So I'll wrap up there, being out of time. So what we do is we thought about this project as essentially try and provide an integrated data and model perspective on trade inflation. It looks like in the data, trade ends up looming large, and in particular, offshoring seems to loom large in reducing the price level. But what the model actually tells us is those shocks in a standard New Keynesian framework likely would trigger inflation. And so in a sense, because this is the trade dynamics conference, what I really learned from this is the trade dynamics mattered a lot for the inflation dynamics. It's just, they didn't matter the way we thought initially. We thought trade was going to reduce inflation when we set out in this project, but the model taught us something different. One thing I'll just add quickly, so we've done everything thus far in this presentation talking about the domestic sourcing shares as a sufficient statistic. I will warn you, if you want to do policy analysis, you can't do that, right? So to do policy analysis of, say, changes in trade costs and their impacts on inflation, you need to model how the import shares are changing, and that's going to require auxiliary assumptions about those trade shares. In particular, what I have found to be very important is it's going to require auxiliary assumptions about price dynamics for imports, what currencies you think imports are invoiced in, and how sticky they are. So that's where I'll leave it. I think we'll add that to the paper eventually, but we're not there yet.
All right, great,
so
Rob.
Thank you.
So, yeah, perfect. So if you stop sharing your screen, then Nan can share hers.
Yep.
Great. Nan, you go ahead and hit the share screen button.
Okay. System preference.
It should be at the bottom. There should just be a green share screen button at the bottom of your screen.
Alt S will.
Yes, I do
Yeah.
see that, and then it's
Okay.
asking me desktop or whiteboard.
Oh, you want desktop,
I
I
guess
guess,
it's
or something like that, right? Wherever.
Yes.
And then you should have your slides, and then need your slides open on your computer.
Yeah, it looks like we don't use Zoom at IMF, but first time I'm using it, and looks like
okay.
it's asking
Try
to
clicking
change
on
my
the blue
system
button
preference.
that says share.
Yeah, I did.
The
The
lower
problem is
right
I need to
one.
change my system preference.
So why don't we just have Kim share the slides?
Yeah, because I
and then-
only have
That's
three
perfect. Yes,
slides,
I will
so-
open. I will do it right now. Yeah, perfect. Good. And then you
Perfect.
talk. Then you talk and just say like next slide, just like in the old days when we used to do this. Where is it? Here we go. Good. Everybody see that?
Yes. Awesome.
Okay.
Thank you,
Nan,
Kim.
take us away. Yeah.
Great. Thanks for inviting me to discuss this very interesting paper. It takes me out of my COVID policy, everyday life, and make me realize there is more life and pretty good life beyond the coronavirus. So I quite enjoy reading this paper. I think the paper contains a host of very useful insights, and it's asking definitely a very important question. In fact, 2 years ago, our member countries at the IMF was asking us to look into how offshoring should change the way we look at real exchange rate. So this is a very crucial question, and it is the paper provides an ex-ante surprising but exposed, I think, somewhat intuitive answer. So that is quite a success. The contribution, I think, it is the paper extends the textbook standard small P economy New Keynesian model to incorporate a relatively rich trade structure and use this very rich model to evaluate the causal effect of offshoring on inflation through the lens of this particular model. And I think bridging the international macro with trade dynamics is a very valuable effort. So I think that's an important contribution. So my intuition of after going through this paper a couple of times, it seems to me the way we think about offshoring. This paper particularly is about expected future permanent decline in domestic sourcing. I think for me, the easier way to interpret is to think about it as a permanent facing improvement in the terms of trade, both in consumption prices and imported intermediate goods prices. So the first effect is the standard conventional effect that you import goods has a lower price and that give you a deflationary pressure. The second effect is through an income effect. So if you think there is a permanent phase-in improvement in the terms of trade, then in real terms, in the flexible exchange rate, in the flexible price scenario, you will feel like currently you're richer, so you're going to front load your consumption that drives inflation up. The last effect is what I call quasi-productivity effect, and that can be amplified by global value chain. And that is when you import domestic, when you import intermediate inputs to provide for domestic production, your production cost is lower. So that is similar to a productivity shock, but it has to be permanent and happen in the future. So it's something similar to a new shock. And there, the consumers in this economy will also be incentivized to consume in the current period, and that drives the current inflation up. So ultimately, I think this is a complicated question that whether the last two effects dominate the first effect. And I had some communication with Rob before. It seems like it's quite robust to different combinations of parameters. So next slide, Kim. Thank you. Yes, so since I only have 5 minutes, I'm going to focus on some big picture comments. My first comment is related to how to interpret the result. Now, as Rob emphasized, and I think that it is an advantage of this to think about the shocks as a domestic sourcing share as a shock. So you circumvent a lot of measurement issue or technical issues. But if we step back and think about this sourcing share, it can be driven by tons of factors. There are policy-related factors, such as trade barriers or domestic distortions, but there are also non-policy-related factors like productivity, growth differential, or structural change. Now, this paper is intentionally agnostic about those drivers, and for good reasons. But the downside of that is lead to what I call interpretation problem. And here, let me elaborate what I mean. So if we go back to that main equation, which is just a counting exercise, has nothing to do with the general equilibrium, your Keynesian part of the model, then you will see the inflation is pinned down by those three components. The last two components are related to trade directly. The middle one is offshoring. So the lambda H is the in domestic sourcing share of inputs, and the last one is the domestic share of consumption. So when you do more trade and more offshoring, those last two components going to go down. That is the conventional deflationary pressure on inflation. But if you want to draw the conclusion in the end that offshoring and the trade in fact is inflationary, then it has to be the case that those two lambdas actually going to increase the first component. And the first component, I think, is basically wage minus productivity, okay? Now, this paper is all about wage. This paper built the whole Keynesian models for open economy to talk about the mechanism behind it. How could offshoring increase the wage inflation? Now, what about this productivity Z? And Kim, if you can flip to the next page, that'll be helpful. So here, suppose let's run this thought experiment. Suppose nothing else happened in this economy. What happened is falling domestic productivity. And I think if we were to endogenize this domestic sourcing share or offshoring, it's very likely that falling domestic productivity will drive offshoring. So you have the last two components also going down. So that is similar as the offshoring story we just talked about. But then it also drives up the first component, and that will, you know, if nothing happened, and if it's just the domestic productivity was falling, it can simultaneously drive offshoring and inflation. And to put it bluntly, an accurate way to describe that is to say actually falling productivity is inflationary and not offshoring, even though offshoring was driven by productivity and manifests itself as if it's offshoring driving the inflation. So I think it boils down to you know, some additional exercise to endogenize. I'm not saying the whole paper needs to endogenize because that is it is quite unnecessary, but maybe one section of the paper should discuss the possibility if those two lambdas, those two domestic sourcing shares were actually endogenized, and maybe simulate the model with the productivity shocks only, and then check what happens to inflation and trade shares. Okay, Kim, the next one. So my next comment is more a step back question. As I said, this paper, if we want to believe, you know, if we want to convince everyone that offshoring is inflationary, first of all, it's equivalent to say offshoring causes wage inflation. And that is even more counterintuitive. But of course, within this model, it is consistent. You can think about, you know, just as news shock or, you know, future productivity shock, you can generate that kind of a feature. But the question is, when I step back and I think about offshoring, it is, you know, the first order issue associated with offshoring people often point to is unemployment and income distribution. So my worry is that would an alternative model with those features generate the opposite result? So if we want to say offshoring is definitely inflationary, is that very model specific? And are those other missing mechanisms, you know, do they matter? And I don't think, again, the model is already very rich. I wouldn't recommend, you know, write down a model with, you know, heterogeneous agents, but maybe at least some discussion or mentioning of those concerns, especially, you know, intuitively, if I think offshoring may raise unemployment and unemployment itself can suppress wage inflation. So that would go opposite forces against what this paper is saying. But of course, whether offshoring raises unemployment is also empirically debatable. Maybe another way to defend the finding is also relate to some micro level evidence. For example, people find using German data, German plant data, find that offshoring actually raise productivity so much that they actually increase domestic employment. So more generally, it's just when I'm thinking about the model is a standard model and there is no like model validation. And we are evaluating the role of offshoring through the standard model, putting it more generally how comfortable we are with the current model to understand this particular issue. In the interest of time, I'm gonna stop here. I can communicate other technical comments with Diego and Rob bilaterally. Thank you.
Okay, great. So that sounds great. What we're going to do is we're going to let Rob maybe respond a bit to your comments. We have just a couple of minutes, and while he's doing that, I'm going to have Jim get his slides uploaded and get ready to go. So Rob, if you'd like to respond. Rob, your mic is off. You need to unmute yourself.
Sorry, that was a meeting fail. So first of all, I want to say thank you to Nan for some very useful comments. She and I actually have already exchanged a whole bunch of emails, and we had a Skype chat as well already about the paper. So it's incredibly valuable to us at this point to get feedback, which is why I'm actually quite happy you moved the conference up to the beginning of the summer rather than leaving it next fall. So in particular, I think the point she's making about productivity is useful conceptually. In particular, it's sort of the final point I made on the slides, but I've been thinking about it in a different context, not the productivity context. So you can only do policy analysis in this model if you move beyond the sufficient statistics, and in particular, the trade shares may be responding to other things like productivity in the model. As we vary the trade shares, that does capture the effect of productivity through the trade shares, but it does ignore the direct effect of productivity. One thing that I spent a lot more time thinking about, I wasn't at all interested in productivity actually initially thinking about this, but what I was far more interested in was actually thinking about trade policy and how that feeds through to inflation in the context of this model. And there again, you have to model how the trade shares are evolving. And I think in conversation with Nan, I think I've decided we need another section in the paper that does that a little more explicitly. I don't think it's going to change any of the central messages about what one should take away from the paper, but I think that's a valuable thing to clarify how to use the domestic sourcing share shocks in analysis. The second thing I'll say, her second point I think is good too about do we believe this model? There's always costs and benefits with using a textbook model. The benefit is it's the textbook. Have I lost you? No. Sorry, I lost all the visuals. Okay, now I see you. I lost all the visuals. I was confused about where you were. The benefit of using a textbook model is everyone kind of understands a textbook model, so you want to make kind of a textbook point. It's useful to use a textbook model. But I am sympathetic to the idea that there are probably lots of things missing from the textbook model that might be useful. Where the highest marginal value added is in terms of kind of changing the results is not obvious to us, right? We've tried multiple sectors. We've added capital. We've added additional shocks in the form of capital inflow shocks. None of those things had any effect. The point she mentioned about unemployment and inequality is actually, I don't know if this is related. Another colleague of mine at the IMF actually also made the same point. So this may be something that's going around at lunchtime at the IMF. My co-author Rudolph's raised a similar issue, and I actually think that could be important in the sense of if offshoring raised inequality in a way that raised the U.S. like MPC, for example, then that would have effects that would counteract the effects that we're finding of that change in offshoring. So I think those models would be useful. We haven't wanted to go that route just because it's such a different framework than we're currently working with. It addresses a whole bunch of different issues. There's some similarity too, I think, between the issues that we have and issues that have arisen both in the productivity news shocks literature, where they find that positive productivity news shocks are inflationary in that literature typically, in theory. And there's also linkages to other literatures like on the forward guidance puzzle in the US as well, where people are trying to break the Euler equation in ways that lead the new Keynesian model to behave better. We could explore some of those extensions. We've decided to stay more textbook and enrich the trade side of the model more than try to elaborate on the new Keynesian structure.